Tommaso.
Welcome, everyone. Hello. Great to see so many of you. Welcome to the Future of Diplomacy's Project Study Group on European Strategic Autonomy towards a new transatlantic balance in security and defense. My name is Tommaso Cariati. I'm a second-year MPA student here at Harvard Kennedy School. And as you can guess from my name, I'm Italian. So it's a real honor and pride to introduce this event and our speaker today. Before we begin, and I begin with my introduction, we invite you to keep your video on and raise a virtual hand to ask a question during the Q&A section. Also, please be aware that this session is being recorded, that your image may appear in the recording, and that we may post this video to the Belfer Center's website. While this virtual event is on the record, the event organizers prohibit any attendees, including journalists, from audiovisual recording or distributing parts of or all of the event program without prior
Okay, it appears we're having some technical issues.
For sure, the sentence was going on without prior authorization.
Without prior authorization, that's right. Tommaso, are you still with us? Okay, he is no longer with us.
Oh, sorry. I'm not sure what the...
okay, there you go.
Yes, apologies. So it is my pleasure, I will restart. It is my pleasure to welcome Federica Mogherini virtually to the Kennedy School. She's the Rector of the College of Europe and the former High Representative for the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission from 2014 to 2019. Her time leading the EU's foreign policy was marked by a number of achievements and strategic changes for the continent. To cite only a couple of examples, she was instrumental in forging the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran and launched the EU's global strategy for foreign policy and security policy. The EU became a much more operative and significant player in the foreign policy space during her tenure, and thanks to her work. Federica's entire career has been dedicated to foreign policy. After graduating in political science from Rome La Sapienza University, she became active in grassroots politics, being elected to the Italian Parliament in 2008. Throughout this time, she was focusing on foreign policy, and immediately after her election, she became part of the Defense and Foreign Policy Parliamentary Committees, before eventually being picked Italy's foreign minister in 2014 as part of the first Renzi government. We are extremely honored and privileged to have her with us today. Welcome, Federica, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. Thank you, Erika, Catherine, thank you all for joining us today, for the invitation, for having arranged this. Let me also say a special word of thanks to Jana, that has also joined us from Bruges, from our College of Europe team that has supported me also in this journey with the Kennedy School, which I'm enjoying very much. It's great to see you, almost all of you, on screen. If you can turn on your camera, I think it's good. We can at least see each other. Unfortunately, we cannot be in the same room together, hopefully one day. As you might have seen from the description of the topic we're handling today, and also a short reading list, we'll try to address in this 1 hour and a half roughly, quite a broad topic, but I would say what a topical one, that of strategic autonomy of the European Union, whether this affects the balance in the security and defense field across the Atlantic. It might be interesting also to see a comparison between how these topics were perceived and worked on during my tenure, 2014, 2019, that coincided partially also with the previous US administration, and what is going to look like with a different kind of framework today, with a different US administration in place, and also obviously a different EU leadership. But on the EU side, I would say there's quite continuity in this respect. I've also highlighted in the description for this session 3 study cases that to which I will go at the end of my short introduction to give you a sense of how the concept of strategic autonomy can be applied in a different manner than it is naturally and usually done. As Tommaso was mentioning, I would say that during my 5 years leading the EU foreign and security policy, one of the main and major achievements we had, and also probably the most time and energy consuming exercise, was the definition of the global strategy in 2016 that we forged with 1 year of consultations with third parties and third countries, including the United States, academia, think tanks, national parliaments, different kind of players. And we adopted in the European Council in the end of June 2016, and that was just a couple of days after the Brexit referendum. This to give you a sense of the fact that the moment when one of the member states had decided to leave, the other 27, and actually the 28, because the UK was still part of it, decided to relaunch a common action in the world with what we would define in the academic sphere as EU actorness at a global level. That was a strange coincidence, I had to say, a non-foreseen one, but also a good occasion, a good opportunity to offer to the European leaders a concrete action field to show unity and resolve to act on a global level. Even if I have to admit that some of my team in these days were advising me to postpone the adoption of the global strategy because it wouldn't have had enough attention. But I went for the other way to offer to the leaders something on which they could unite and relaunch the EU visibility worldwide. And by the way, that was very much supported also by the United Kingdom, that contributed enormously to shaping the global strategy itself. So in that global strategy that is still valid today, still in the point of reference of the EU foreign and security policy, one important part of it is dedicated to how to strengthen the EU work on defense. This is a long-standing issue. It's probably since 1950s that the issue of European defense comes back again and again on the table of decision makers in Europe, without actually ever achieving anything of really relevance in practical terms, because defense, as you know, is by definition the field of national sovereignty. And as you can imagine, European member states that had spent decades, if not centuries, fighting each other, including militarily, took some time to move to the concept of delegating or sharing responsibilities in the field of defense. The big change in 2016 was that member states at that moment were ready to move forward and implement measures on European cooperation on defense that were already foreseen by the treaties, but were never put in practice. A set of measures, if you are interested in that, I can elaborate more on that. In particular, the permanent structure cooperation was adopted by unanimity with the UK still there, that allows member states in smaller groups to start a project of cooperation, in particular on capabilities, on industrial developments, but also on operations in more restricted formats within the EU framework. So with the application of the differentiation principle in practice in the field of defense, which is one of the most sensitive ones, as I said. But also other measures were implemented. None of those steps were in itself revolutionary in the meaning that it was not introducing changes in the legal framework of the Union. There was no treaty changes, but altogether even individually, all those measures were never taken before. For instance, the establishment of a command center in Brussels for the training missions of the European Union in Africa, the comparison and adjustments of the member states' budgets on defense to fine-tune the investments, and in general terms, and also, sorry, I mentioned, forgotten, probably one of the most relevant ones, the launch of the European Defence Fund that mobilized European Union resources, so European Union budget, to incentivize common projects in the field of research and industrial production in the field of defense and dual use. This was definitely, if you put the defense package that was launched in 2016 together, was by far the biggest step in European defense ever in European history. And we often said together, this work was done with the ministers of defense and ministers of foreign affairs of the member states and with the European Commission as well. We often said in those days that more was done in those 2-3 years than in the 60 years before. And that was indeed true. In parallel to that, there was a reference to the strategic autonomy of the European Union and the need to invest in it. Some have interpreted this as an attempt to create some distance, if not some competition or even conflict with NATO. I have to say, having lived this process and led this process from within, that this was actually the contrary. From the very first day of the adoption of the global strategy, 2016, we actually, before even the adoption of the global strategy, exchanges with the NATO at all levels, from staff members to military staff, to the Secretary General with myself, exchanges were constant, and we always got the support of the NATO Secretary General for what we were doing. And if you track, if you're interested in that, if you track the public declarations of Stoltenberg in those years, 2016, 2017, up to now actually, but in particular 2016, 2018 were the crucial years for the implementation of this defense package. He has always been extremely supportive of the EU defense package, of the EU defense plans, pointing out the fact that having the Europeans working, or the European Union working to incentivize economy of scale on the European side of the Atlantic was the only way to fill in the capability gap that NATO had pointed out at many times for many years, and that with own national resources only, member states of the European Union were not able to achieve. So NATO identified very early on the work that the European Union was doing on defense as the key instrument to increase investments, and obviously the 2% objective of GDP spending in defense is an objective that NATO allies have decided in 2014. But more than that, to increase the output on capability work. Because working together, reducing fragmentation and investments in capabilities projects was the way to guarantee that you don't have on the European side of the alliance 27 or 28 or 10 different operational setups on which then you have to work on the interoperability. Now, without going too much on the defense technical issues, if you're interested in some of them, I'm happy to get deeper on one or the other. In practical terms, NATO always identified the work on the European defense the European Union was doing as an asset and not as a challenge. But the public debate and some part of the debate in the US actually started to reflect upon the risks of duplication or competition. I have to say that this happened in particular with the beginning of the Trump administration. Before that moment, the work on European defense was just beginning. So it actually coincided with the beginning of the Trump administration, and the Trump administration had quite a conflictual narrative towards the European Union in general terms. There is no mistake, no mystery, and in particular on the defense work. There is one element that I would like to clarify here. For the European Union, the concept of strategic autonomy doesn't mean to operate against anybody, and it doesn't mean to operate without the United States. But it means that the European Union and its member states should have the capacity to elaborate by themselves which are the policy priorities and potentially the instruments to achieve them, possibly together with the United States, which is the privileged partner. But in case the United States and the European Union are not aligned on policy priorities, the European Union should be able to operate or to act according to its own policy priorities. So what I always refer to is more than a strategic autonomy, a cooperative autonomy, the capacity to act autonomously, but always looking for cooperation first, and only going alone if this is necessary or needed, but always as a second option, not the first one. Now, this is often applied to the domain of defense, and you would find the concept of strategic autonomy mainly referred to the military sphere. But if you look at the study cases I indicated for the description of this conversation we have today, you would not find really defense and security, a traditionally military defense angle to what I suggest. Because the three study cases I propose to you today to elaborate around the concept of strategic autonomy and how the European Union strategic autonomy actually contributes to the transatlantic security are purely policy areas that do not relate to military aspects of our cooperation. The first one is the peace process in Afghanistan. I would refer to the years 2014, 2019, even if there would be a lot to say in these recent days, but this is out of scope of our talks. The second one is the nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, indeed, and the third one is the work in the Balkans. In none of these areas you would find a specific military aspect of the European Union involvement. In the Balkans, yes, in the Balkans, the European Union has some military operations mandated by the UN Security Council. So there is also an angle in which, through military presence on the ground in the Balkans, and namely in Kosovo, it's a civilian mission, and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, through a presence on the ground, the EU contributes to global security, including transatlantic security. But the three examples I want to raise with you today are more to broaden the scope of the concept of strategic autonomy and see how the foreign policy of the European Union, if needed, applied in an autonomous manner vis-a-vis the United States, can contribute to transatlantic security. The most evident example is the nuclear deal with Iran, I would say. A deal that we negotiated together, the European Union facilitating the negotiations, the United States, Russia, China, the UK, France, Germany, and Iran sitting around the table. A deal that has been negotiated for 13 years, agreed upon in July 2015, entering to force, implemented in 2016, January 2016, and then with the Trump administration, the United States withdrawing from that. In that moment, when Trump announced the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, the European Union exercised strategic autonomy, not in the military sense, but in a political sense, when it decided that it would have had function, or it would have tried to have the function of upholding the JCPOA, trying to keep all the other parties engaged and committed, even if the United States administration was asking us not to do so. In that moment, the European Union exercised strategic autonomy, politically, not militarily, but politically, with the idea that this would have been functional and useful for the security also of the transatlantic community and the United States. And today, with the talks being resumed in Vienna as we speak, we see the reasoning for that. The action of the European Union back then was what allowed the new US administration now to restart talks with an agreement somehow in place, not in good shape, but somehow in place. Everybody at that moment would have bet that following the US withdrawal from the agreement, Iran would also have withdrawn. There would have been no agreement at all, and there would have been no restarting point for a new US administration. And probably Iran would have gone nuclear already without any kind of agreement in place. So in that moment, the European Union exercised strategic autonomy politically, resisting pressure from Washington in connection and in coordination with other partners, in unity among European Union member states. And this served as a security element also for the United States and the Transatlantic Community. Example number two, very quickly, on Afghanistan, even if less relevant, less highlighted by the mediatic environment, in the moment when the Trump administration launched talks with the Taliban, the European Union had a slightly different approach, kept a certain angle of strategic autonomy in its mediation and facilitation process. Politically, it exercised a different kind of role, liaising with the regional powers, with the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, and with the Afghan government itself, that was not sitting at the table with the Taliban and the US administration, so felt excluded by those talks. That was the moment when the European Union liaised with the Afghan government, trying to bring that into the process of talks. In that moment, that was a choice the European Union made autonomously. That was coordinated and not opposed by the US administration, but it was clearly an autonomous track of work. Again, today it would be interesting to see how this impacts on the situation today, where we have a different dynamic. But that was another example where indeed an autonomous choice of European Union actually contributed and supported, in this case, both a security and diplomatic effort of the United States in having the peace talks with the Taliban. Third example, before I conclude and we open the conversation, because each of these elements I quickly mentioned can be developed in different directions. So I leave it up to you then to ask or go deeper into one direction or another, or to bring to the table other topics. I'm obviously open and ready to discuss everything else. Last example I would make is the Balkans. In the Balkans, as you know, apart from the purely security work that we do there as a follow-up of the peace agreements after the war in the 90s, there the work that the European Union does with the Balkan countries is an autonomous one in the sense that it's a standalone. It's a work that the European Union does in terms of economic and political investments, in terms of work to make those countries entering the European Union one day when they will be ready, so negotiations ongoing or in preparation. And that is a work that has, in principle, not too much to do with security, but in reality, a lot to do with security. If you think that it was only a few decades ago that those countries were at war, and without the perspective for each of them to join one day the European Union, probably the reconciliation process in the Balkans would not work. What manages to keep relatively a cooperative atmosphere and some cooperative projects among the Balkan countries that were at war a few decades ago is the fact that they benefit from the same funding from the European Union. They are incentivized to do common projects in infrastructural terms, or even in political or diplomatic terms, and that all of them aspire at entering the European Union. And they know that either they cooperate in this race to the European Union, or they would not manage, none of them. And so the European Union, acting autonomously there, even if in close cooperation with the US, but purely autonomously, guarantees the relative calm and security environment in the Balkans, has prevented, I cannot mention how many times we have prevented conflict from happening on the ground overnight, over the weekend, over small provocations that could have become major clashes among countries. So in that sense, the European Union, through its mere existence and its power of attractiveness, guarantees a certain security environment that is beneficial also for obviously the region, but also the United States and the transatlantic community, and has allowed some of those countries to join NATO. And this is also potentially an element of acceleration for membership to the European Union. So you see, probably if you see in one region in the world, you see really an integrated, coordinated approach and mutually beneficial approach between the European Union and NATO, that's exactly the Balkans, where you really have a daily coordination and a synergy that is unique, but where the European Union is completely autonomous in defining its policy and its measures towards the Balkans. I think I'll stop here because I've spoken already for something like half an hour, and that's far longer than I expected to do. I hope that what I said makes sense. It's always difficult to give a class like this because I should have started by a round of presentations from your side to get to know you a little bit and to know also your background. So I might have said things that are more than obvious to you, or I might have said things that don't make any sense to you because you've studied completely different things. So feel free to ask any kind of question or to question my my approach or my assumptions. And again, happy to develop any of these arguments further, to have a discussion, a conversation with you on this, but also on any other issue you might want to refer to in the transatlantic sphere. I'm perfectly aware, we did it on purpose. I tried to identify areas and examples that are a little bit exotic compared to China, Russia, the main points that you're used to focus on in the EU-U.S. Relations today, exactly to show that the field of cooperation, real and potential, is huge. And actually, I could decline the same kind of reasoning on Latin America, on the Indo-Pacific, on Korean Peninsula, on the Sahel situation, or on Central African Republic, you name it. But wherever you look in the map in the world, there is no place that is exempted from receiving a beneficial boost to security, and not only security, from a coordinated approach between the European Union and the US, even though, as I said in the beginning, in times of difficulties, it might be good for the European Union, as it is for the United States, to keep clarity on what principles and interests are, and if we find ourselves in disagreement, have the possibility and the capabilities to still work on the principles, values, and theories we have. I'll stop it here, and thank you for the attention, and looking forward to our exchange.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mogherini. I invite anybody who wants to ask a question to raise their virtual hand, and we'll call on you sequentially. And as Ms. Mogherini said, please introduce yourself briefly. Where are you in the world? What are you studying at HKS or at Harvard or anywhere else? And a bit about your background. So with that, Stefan, please.
Oh, hello. First of all, thank you for coming virtually to Harvard and having this event with us. So I'm an LLM student at Harvard Law School, technically on a leave of absence now, working in a law firm in Zagreb, but with a clear interest in EU law and a bit of tech law as well. Now, my wish to ask you is, could you a bit further develop your thinking on that question? Should the EU have its own army? I know there's some discussion in the reading that we received, and this was one of my interests at my LLM, at previous LLM at LSE, so I'll be very eager to hear your thoughts on it.
With pleasure. Shall I take it one by one? Erika, is
Yes,
that
for
fine?
now.
Good. Yes, you will find a lot of interesting articles and publications in this. And this is one of the most debated issues around the EU defense policy. Even when we started to implement the global strategy in 2016, 2017, many were referring to it as a way to get to the European army. I have to admit personally, but maybe that's because of my political background, politicians always try to focus on how to get to the objective first. Personally, in that moment, I was always very careful in avoiding reference to the European army, because that is a very controversial debate within the European Union and outside the European Union. And my personal approach was to reverse the logic that was in place in the previous decades and in Europe, and that was that of defining the ultimate goal, the European army, for instance, the full integration, and then see how to get there. I tried to take the opposite approach and to say, okay, we have some assets, we have some instruments in the treaties already. that we're not using on defense cooperation. Let's start to use what we have and let's see where it leads us. And a step-by-step approach with the purpose also of reassuring member states and bringing them on board. So we managed to do this unanimously at 28, still with the UK. The UK voted in favor of all this defense package after the Brexit referendum. That was really always an impressive thing. But exactly because we try to take a reassuring approach and saying, this is not leading there. This is simply using the instruments we have to be more efficient, to use our money more efficiently, and to be sure that we do some steps forward. And then the debate on the future will come. In reality, if you think of what a European army means, you can have different views. Having been serving the Defense Committee of the Italian National Parliament, I would tell you with the national angle that a European army that would substitute the armies of the 27 member states will never see the light. Do you see one defense minister replacing 27, one chief of staff, the chain of command, even the language used in the army? And for sure, we would not have, well, for sure, most of our member states would not accept giving up their own army or their own military forces to have a buy-in in a European one, and understandably so. So if you think of a European army that substitutes national armies, I don't think this will ever happen. For many obvious reasons, political, but also operational, to tell you the truth. If you refer to European army, if you use European army to indicate a functional military structure ready to operate, including in theaters and with a quick decision-making procedures and with the resources allocated for that, trained together with a common analysis and a common culture of defense, then that is, yes, definitely possible. And I think that these steps can and actually will lead to this kind of environment. We do have one instrument that is dormant, and that it's among the instruments I tried to activate, but didn't get there in the course of my mandate. I was hoping to be the next one, and that is the use of the battle groups. The battle groups are there, are not only foreseen, but also in theory present, operational, but never used. And I tried for 4 years to activate that instrument during my mandate, and always found a difficulty in doing that for one simple but relevant reason, and that is the mechanism with which a battle group operation is funded. There is no division of labor in the financing of that among member states, and this puts the burden of the operation on the shoulders of the coordinating nation, which is very rarely ready or never ready to take that burden alone. And so I've always indicated this need to reform the funding system, the financing system, and the fourth generation system of the battle groups to make them work. But that could be a way to have a sort of operational European army to be used. Having said that, and I say this mainly for our American students, I guess European ones know more about that. But having said that, the European Union has a military that is deployed in the world. I think that currently it's 16 or 17 among military and civilian operations and missions around the world, with thousands of women and men in uniform under EU flag, with their own uniforms from the member states, but under one unified command for every operation. I visited most of them around the world, and they are real military operations under the EU flag. So there is a projection of a military force of the European Union, but the decision-making of that involves all the member states and the fourth generation as well. Having said that, sometimes it's very long, the launch of a EU operation. Some other times it's very short. The first time we launched Operation Sophia in the Mediterranean Sea between Italy and Libya in 2015. It took us 1 month between the decision was proposed and the vessels were at sea, 1 month only. And we had something like 23 member states, nationalities involved. So if there is political will, the decision making can also be quick. And that sometimes for launching a national military operation, sometimes it takes longer. So it can be operational.
Thank you for your answer. Colin, go ahead.
Hi, yes, thank you for taking my question and for joining us today. I'm a senior at Harvard College and an aspiring U.S. Marine officer, but I'm afraid that means I don't know all that much about European policy, so forgive me if my question's uninformed.
I'm here for that.
I noted in your 2 examples in the Middle East with the JCPOA and Afghanistan peace talks, as you pointed out, those were primarily diplomatic. So I was just curious, given the capacity you just mentioned for EU military operations, what role you see kind of the EU taking on in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly if it's coincidental with kind of a US drawdown in those regions?
That's a very good question. Normally, well, first of all, I'll tell you a bit more if you're interested in that, in the nature, the kind of military operations the European Union has around the world, because so much is the attention not to overlap or to duplicate, neither with NATO or with the UN, which are our 2 main pillars of reference, I would say. So much is the case right now already that we try to define what is the specific angle through which the European Union military or civilian security presence can contribute to, without doing things that others could do better. And so mainly the European Union missions and operations focus on training security forces that can be military or can be also civilian security forces. Do you say that in English? Yes, probably yes. Police, border management, but also judicial system, and all that goes together with the rule of law and security sector reform. For instance, the European Union is present in Iraq before NATO was to train the police, which is something that normally NATO doesn't do. And NATO came later to do a parallel operation to assist and support the military forces. But in the meantime, the European Union was training the civilian police and trying to work on the security sector reform. In Afghanistan, for instance, while NATO was already present since many years, the European Union launched and then concluded successfully a training mission, quite massive one, to train the Afghan police forces again, with a specific angle to training to women in the police force and the human rights angle, something on which the Afghan police forces were, let's say, lacking training so far. In Africa, on the contrary, the EU operations are, I would say, more of a hard security nature. There's a training of military forces in several countries, in Mali, in Niger, in the Central African Republic, if I'm not wrong. So it's training of military forces purely. In some cases, is also moving to train and equip, which is also definitely a hard security mandate. In Somalia, it's also I would say a sort of hard security kind of approach. At sea, you might have heard of Operation Atalanta off the coast of the Horn of Africa that dismantled piracy, and that was extremely effective, extremely dangerous. And that was indeed an operation that is still indeed an operation that is with, I think, with the UN mandate to even attack vessels in the case of attacks to commercial vessels or others. And I mentioned before Operation Sophia, that was operational between 2015 and 2019. And that was a military operation with a UN Security Council mandate that was basically intercepting and stopping and seizing vessels used for smuggling people, but also was monitoring and implementing the arms and oil embargo, which implied a certain use of force towards some of the vessels that were trafficking illicitly oil and arms into Libya. What else? There are other kind of operations and missions that are more of a rule of law nature. And in particular, I can think of the Middle East. We have still some presence, but that's very limited in Israel and Palestine in terms of support to border management or to Palestinian civilian security forces. But obviously that has ended up in almost nothing given the lack of progress on the political track. And I mentioned already a massive presence of the European Union on the ground in Kosovo for reasons you can clearly imagine. The EU presence in Kosovo is double nature. In Pristina is working on the development of the rule of law and judiciary, and so it's more on the civilian side of justice and security, including police, while in the Serbian communities of Kosovo, it's on the contrary about. I don't think this is the definition of the mandate of the United Nations, but having visited the mission itself, I would rather say that it's more of a peacekeeping and even certain conflict prevention nature on the ground. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina is in the frame of cooperation with NATO and still the implementation of the Dayton agreements. This, and probably I'm missing some others around the world. For sure, in Africa we have more. And there has been also some cooperation on maritime security in Southeast Asia, I think. So it's really a variety of issues. I would say that in the Middle East at large, the European Union approach has been that of avoiding duplicating presence of NATO, for sure, on a military ground, also because the European Union is not a military alliance. So the European Union has some assets, particularly on the integrated approach. So whenever you have to blend some elements of hard security and soft security, or civilian or military, that is something Europeans do well. So in certain areas where NATO was operating already on the military side or was planning to go, we avoided operating on our side, or we defined together with NATO in which fields, like police training, the European Union added value complements the NATO work. In other fields, I think, for instance, of Africa, where the European Union presence on the ground on a military level is better perceived than the NATO one for, I would say, historical reasons, then we are more present. And then there are some areas, I think of the Mediterranean, for instance, I mentioned that, where both NATO and the European Union have been present or are present, and there is a coordination and division of labor. I'm not sure it answered your question, but I tried.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Tori?
Hi, good morning, Rector Mogherini and everyone. My name is Tori Tausig, and I work in Ambassador Burns's programs at the Kennedy School with Erica and Catherine. I'm excited to join the call today, and thank you for letting me interlope with a question in this student group. But I wanted to ask you about how you see strategic autonomy developing in the financial sector. And I'm thinking about this specifically in the context of how we've seen the weaponization of the dollar in recent years and US sanctions on Iran, Nord Stream 2, Cuba, Venezuela, that have really hurt European companies in many ways. And looking to the not so distant future, how these might be carried out, secondary sanctions on China, How do you see the EU and European member states trying to strengthen its financial autonomy in an era where secondary sanctions may be imposed in the China context, and it could hurt European companies even further than we've seen in the past?
Thanks for the question, because very often I actually decline the concept of strategic autonomy along 3 pillars, and today I missed this one. I normally refer to the security and defense one, that is the one on which traditionally we focus, the political and diplomatic one, that is the one I focused on today, and then there's indeed the economic and financial one, that is probably the one that was striking us the most in the last years of my mandate, 2018-19, where we indeed found out. We knew already on paper, but leaving things is always different than reading them. We found out that even if we had taken the strategically autonomous decision of keeping the JCPOA in place, we were not, as the European Union, as national governments of the EU member states, we were not in a position of actually making sure that our private companies and banks were engaging with Iran as we wanted that to happen, as it was legitimate, both for national legislation, European legislation, and UN Security Council resolutions. We could not push them or force them to do so because their exposure to the US financial system was too high. And so that was the moment when we realized that frontier of financial autonomy and the use of autonomous financial systems, starting from the currency to the SWIFT, was actually key in having the power to be autonomous in the implementation of your policy decisions, because that was really a perfect case to study. You take an autonomous political decision to stick to the JCPOA. You adopt all the internal legislations needed. You have the UN legal framework. You have the international support. You have your banks and your companies interested in doing that. And then you end up not doing it because of the implications of the extraterritorial effects of the US sanctions. In that moment, that was the end of the previous commission in 2019, I would say. We tried to put an instrument in place that is called INSTEX to try and protect European investments shield, I would say, European investments from the legal implications of some legal actions that could have been taken from the US side. It worked only to a very, very, very limited amount of money, I would say. And it was not new, actually, in terms of experience, because as you mentioned, with Cuba, we had exactly the same experience, and we still have, I think, because the impact of the US extraterritorial sanctions on the European investments in Cuba is extremely heavy, and he's hitting especially some countries more than others. And again, this is purely a matter of autonomy. You have a legislation, your companies and banks comply to your legislation, and yet they're sanctioned. And so what is the jurisdiction that you have on your own territory if you cannot determine your laws, or you can determine your laws, but then another player, another actor can define who can be sanctioned in your own territory with a decision that is taken elsewhere. So, well, first of all, we've always argued that the extraterritorial impact of sanctions should not be in place. We don't consider it, in the European Union, we don't consider it as a legitimate and even legal instrument. But there is also another element you mentioned, and that is the use of currency. That is really at the frontier between foreign policy and has some security implications, but it's mainly on the financial side of work. So in the European Commission, actually, this is not so much for the role I had, but more for the Vice President for Financial and Economic Policies. So it used to be, and currently still is, Dombrovskis, the Vice President that is trying to work on this file. But I perfectly remember there was a certain moment in 2018, 17, 18, where many third countries, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, that were asking us to use the euro for transactions with Iran because they couldn't use the dollar anymore, especially in oil and gas. And it was not possible. And there was a lot of frustration, I would say. And not to mention the SWIFT problem. So I think that this is going to be, if you ask me, the test for the real strategic autonomy of the European Union will be this. I don't have the answer on how to do it, but again, it's not my job. I'm just on foreign and security policy. Financial things, I leave it to the experts. But to me, that was and still is the test for the autonomy of Europe.
Do you think cryptocurrency is a potential path forward?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I would not elaborate on things. I would not bring added value, not a valuable one. I can have opinions, but I don't have knowledge enough to elaborate on that. I'll stick to my field. Thank you.
Wise enough to know what we do not know. So Gopal, please go ahead.
Thank you, Erica. Hello, Rector Mogherini. My name is Gopal Nadadur. I'm in the Kennedy School's MPAID program, the International Development Program. I'm from India, currently somewhere in the middle of Maine on a motorcycle trip. My question to you was more about, so coming from India with a history of the non-aligned movement and strategic autonomy, balancing between the US and USSR, or trying to for decades. Even more recently, there's this level of skepticism or impatience from American counterparts about strategic autonomy. And there's this desire on their part that we pick sides very clearly. I'm wondering, and some of your readings also mentioned how there needs to be a gradual process whereby the EU develops more strategic autonomy space, perhaps through more tactical, taking over military operations in some regions and so on. But I'm just curious for your thoughts about how this impatience perhaps will need to be managed over the next 5 to 10 years as the EU carves out its strategic autonomy. I realize that might be quite a vague question. I apologize.
It is, but that's okay. That we're here to think or try to. I think we have two kind of impatience. I guess that what you refer to with the Indian background is the impatience that the United States in particular, but probably also the West more widely, has towards countries like India in the past, mainly, but also today, about choosing sides. And this is typically a Western approach, I have to say. I think that, for instance, some elements of this you found also in the European Union positioning towards the Eastern countries of Europe in a moment when, as a certain moment, we asked them to choose between Europe and Russia, and probably without realizing that they could come closer to Europe without completely cutting ties with Russia because of cultural and even religious or linguistic reasons, not to mention history and geography. So sometimes I have the feeling that in Europe, we also have that tendency to push for choosing sides and without realizing that that might be counterproductive, because if you push too much for picking sides, then you might push your interlocutor on the other side, which might be less pushy and less demanding. But then there's another attitude, and I think in Europe we have experienced that sometimes, less so, but to a certain extent, and we might see that happening now in the coming years. From the United States, I don't think that anybody in the United States can ask Europe to choose side, because it is self-evident we are on the same side already. So that there's no side to choose for the European Union, for Europe. There's one side, and there's the transatlantic community. There's nothing else. But I have one concern, and that is that there might be the attitude in the United States to think that the agenda can be set up in the United States, and then whoever wants join. And it doesn't work like that in the world of today. In the world of today, partnerships work if you define interests and values together, if you sit down together and define what to do together, or even to define what to do separately in a coordinated approach. You define a common strategy, and then each of you has a different role to play. You can have you can have a common decision on a coordinated policy, which gives you different roles to play. This is a fundamental, even philosophical difference in approaches. If the United States gets trapped in the illusion that they can lead and then ask who follows, I'm afraid that this will not work in the world of today. While if the message is we're back, so we talk, we compare notes, we decide to do what to do together, and then we even have a division of labor, that's perfectly fine. And that, I think, would be a strategy that would bring the United States back to a worldwide leadership, because the power of attraction, both soft and hard and financial, is still huge. But I think that there's this gap of understanding that is potentially there, that, as you said, you cannot just ask to pick sides. Also because there's plenty of sides, it's not just two. It's not the Cold War anymore. And there's a lot of competition out there, and there's a lot of other world players that might be, in the short term, easier interlocutors for middle powers to refer to because of the lack of conditionalities, because of different kind of narratives, because of perception in public opinions. So I think the United States in particular, and again, Europe is not exempted from that, and sometimes we do as well, but we should be very careful in not having any kind of patronizing approach, saying, you know, I know what is right, I'm back, you just follow. I don't think this kind of way would work in the world of today. I think it might, it might backfire. I don't know if I got your question.
Absolutely, you did. Thank you. You've given me a lot of food for thought. And
if I can add maybe on to develop a little bit more the self-criticism of the European side, I think that there was a moment that this is my personal opinion, having seen developments in the years 2014, 2015 in particular. I think there were moments where in some particular countries in the east of Europe, the European Union has tried to put it as a binary choice. You're with us or you're against us. And again, without realizing that maybe the leaderships were ready for that, but not necessarily the public opinions. And that made it more difficult for the leaderships to do the right thing. And so sometimes it's actually, I think personally, it's politically wiser to say, you know, we're here. This is what we can offer to you in terms of partnership, in terms of reform support, in terms of things we can do together in the region or economically, commercially, in terms of infrastructures. And this obviously would create a partnership, a special one, but this is not against anyone. And I think that this opens the space for a more relaxed kind of negotiations in some border countries in particular. I think, for instance, of Central Asian countries where, you know, how can they choose? They are geographically between China and Russia and economically projected towards Europe. And you cannot go there and say, okay, now you become our friends and you forget about all the others, because geography is something you don't change. And so I think you have to be humble and realistic in what you consider possible from your partner to do in terms of immediate steps. And that actually could lead them to a very far reaching partnership over time, but in a gradual and sustainable manner. Let's put it this way.
If no one else has any questions, Gopal, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, if that's okay, Erica.
Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Rector Mogherini. So building on your last point, that level of comfort with being there for a partner, but not forcing them to choose sides. It just strikes me as something that takes a high level of self-assurance and security in one's own role in the world, and especially given how global geopolitics are changing right now. There's a lot of lack of self-assurance on a number of fronts, and in the U.S., for instance. And so, yeah, do you see that level of assurance as being feasible to achieve in the next 5-10 years? Is it going to be a longer process than that?
Yeah, what I described is what I believe would be good. It's not what I believe is happening. So I'm telling you that I believe that having seen some of the lessons in the past, in general terms, and in particular coming from the United States or Europe, the pushy approach doesn't always pay. Let's put it this way. But it's true that the current geopolitical dynamics are binary ones. You see the main world powers adopting that kind of attitude and reaching out to potential partners saying, you're with me, you're against me, and if you're not with me, goodbye, good luck. Goodbye and good luck. This is what is happening currently and since a few years. I think this is an approach that the Russian Federation has in its DNA, I would say. That is probably the natural continuation of a self-perception of an empire and the Soviet Union. So spheres of influence. So you're mine, and if you're mine, you cannot be of others. This has been, I think, consolidated during the Trump administration because the United States started to do the same. The same kind of message, not the same of the Russian Federation, don't get me wrong, but the same kind of message, of narrative of you're against me or you're with me, and the binary choice was the main narrative, while before the United States had a much more nuanced multilateral kind of approach to international relations. So that accelerated, I would say, this kind of approach. And then you've seen other big or mid powers globally to start doing the same on regional scale, all over the place, from Latin America to Asia to everywhere. I think China has actually a different kind of approach. I think China is utilizing an approach of, well, interestingly enough, it's combining still a very aggressive stance in terms of use of investments and loans and the same concept of sphere of influence, but combined with a narrative that is insisting on the fact that it's not a superpower, but still a developing country, which is part of its outreach narrative because it is appealing for the other developing countries. Obviously, it's reassuring. So actually, if I have to say, if there's one self-confident actor and player in the world today, it's probably China. It's the only one that is not using the binary approach narrative. China is not going to African countries saying, if you get my loan, you don't get any other money from anybody else. On the contrary, they say, we're multilateralists in theory. Get a loan and then you'll pay back whenever it will be. Then it costs a lot, but down the road. But they don't put themselves in open conflict with anybody else. On the contrary, the narrative continues to be the win-win. The main Chinese narrative officially is still the win-win. And it's probably the only other power apart from Europe. And I hope now the United States will develop also in that direction, saying that it's not normal, it's not okay to divide the world in black and white. But Europe, I think, has tried to keep this cooperative narrative for the last years, increasingly challenged. And it's more difficult to keep your narrative if around you see different kind of dynamics. So you see more and more inside Europe also starting to argue that we should enter into a more power politics approach. I personally believe this would be a mistake, counterproductive, because you should do what you're better at. If you're competing on a terrain, on a ground that is not yours, you're probably not going to win. Yeah, what I described is what I believe would be would be right and also what would work, I believe. I give you an example. After the Ukraine crisis and tensions and including some violations of territorial integrity from the Russian Federation, not only in Ukraine, but also in Georgia and Moldova, at a certain moment, we had, in Europe, we have these Eastern Partnership agreements with 6 countries. And at a certain moment, Armenia and Azerbaijan were in a difficult place on this binary choice approach. And the moment when we told them, we can have an agreement with you, and especially in Armenia that had an agreement with Russia already, we can have an agreement with you. And it's perfectly fine if you keep your agreement with Russia, provided that there are no elements of contradiction in the clauses of the agreements. So we have to go through everything together, but it's okay to be friends with both. In the moment when we had the courage of saying that, which was not an easy political step, we signed an agreement after 6 months. That was blocked since, I don't know how many years. Again, it's controversial. Many other Europeans would tell you other things. But in my experience, you have to have first of all, you have to have the humility of understanding and studying, first studying and then understanding what is the other side position, condition more than position. What is the public opinion? What is the culture? What is the language? What is the religion? We've seen really a lot of tensions around that. What is the identity that is perceived by the population without forcing a leadership to join you, contrary to the public opinion, majority opinion doesn't work. And so I think you have to first understand what is the condition that a leadership has inside their own country to measure to what extent you can go, to agree that together without imposing any step. And then you have, I think, more possibilities to have partnerships and agreements. But again, sometimes it's the contrary. In Ukraine, it was exactly the contrary. In Ukraine, the people was on board and the leadership was not. So here I'm taking only some elements to say, in general terms, I have the impression that the follow me approach is not necessarily the one that is going to be most efficient if we want to build global networks of partnerships.
We have a question in the chat from someone who's named themselves Nigel Farage. Thanks for joining us, Nigel. So given the US is shifting attention to the Indo-Pacific, what sort of increasing role do you see the EU taking in patrolling its own southern neighborhood? The article from Carnegie Europe argues the EU taking charge in at least one major regional crisis, e.g. in Iraq, Libya, or Mali, is that a likely future? And I have a follow-up question of my own on that, which is the foreign ministers of Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and the UAE are meeting today to discuss strengthening partnership in that Eastern Mediterranean region. So I was wondering how you see that sort of developing, speaking of the Southern European neighborhood, and how is the EU going to manage that partnership?
Yeah, the European approach, talking about the first question first, the European approach to the Mediterranean and the Middle East in general has always been to the regional crisis. What is referred to as regional crisis? Well, if you talk about European regional crisis, I think we have something like 20. So we have a long list of crises to take care of, because here focus is on the south, but if you look at the eastern neighborhood, we have quite a good number of crises and quite acute, as you can see in Ukraine in these days. It's the narrative that Europe should deal with its own crisis in the region, I think is not really going to fly, not for Europe, but for the rest of the world. the crisis around which the Security Council exercises itself the most often are in our region. You take the Security Council agenda and probably 70%, 80% is in what you can define our neighborhood. Can we say that we decide and we manage this crisis alone in Europe and we forget about the rest of the world? Not sustainable politically, I think, not sustainable geopolitically, probably not sustainable even in terms of effectiveness, because almost none of this crisis has anymore a purely regional dimension. In each of these crises, you have players and key players that are very far away from our region, and in some cases are sitting in the Security Council. So it would be unnatural, and it would be artificial, and for sure not leading to solution if the European Union was to tackle any of these issues alone. What it can do and what it should do, I believe, is to take the lead. That yes, there is a difference between acting alone and leading together with others, but taking the responsibility to lead. I've always thought that on some crises, Libya for sure, but even Syria, Europeans have more knowledge than others in understanding the dynamics, as it is the case for the Balkans, because we're closer to the region, we understand the logic, we understand the culture. Maybe it's because I'm Mediterranean. I strongly believe that if people share the same environment, the same food, the same culture, the same music, sometimes they have the tendency to understand better the way in which the brain works. And sometimes you don't define dynamics even on conflict and crisis. You don't define the dynamics only on paper. You take Libya, for sure you can have all the intelligence you want, but for sure people of the region understand better how a solution can be found, because they understand better the reasons for the crisis to be there in the first place. There is even a psychological element in there. So I think that Europe should take the lead much more in proposing solutions or patterns or roadmaps for the solution of some of these crises. I don't think we have the capacity to do that for all the crises we have around us, because that would mean from Belarus to Libya, Mali, but also Niger, Horn of Africa, Somalia. Somalia is the neighborhood of our neighborhoods. I mean, the European region is so broad that you get the Gulf and to Afghanistan very easily, and Caucasus. And again, it's probably a list of 20 plus crises, and the most acute ones. The ones that even after 10 years, the Security Council of the UN and hundreds of envoys and special envoys of all the countries put together have not managed to solve. So yes, we can be self-confident, but we also have to be realistic on what we can achieve or not. Again, I'm sure that on some specific crises, and this is why I was saying in the beginning, it can be crucial at this stage for the US administration and the EU leadership to sit down together and compare notes, which is something that was not done for a long time. And comparing notes is the basis for sharing analysis and taking decisions and policies shaping. And then identify who has an added value more than others on which file, and define common strategies where you have a division of labor. You can decide that the US focuses more on something else and the European Union focuses more on something else, and maybe Australia or Canada or you name it, or Japan or whatever, South Korea. But there is clearly a need to define coordinated multilateral strategies to face this crisis. For sure, on some of these regional crises, the European Union has a lot to contribute to in terms of leading. And it is doing so in some cases. On Iran, I think it is, rightly so. On Libya, a bit more difficult. On Mali, in Mali, the European Union has a lot of presence together with all the member states. I mean, in Mali, it's France that is still there with Barkhane, and a massive UN presence that is basically defending itself. But the Europeans are the ones that in Mali are trying to do most of the security work. So sometimes it doesn't show much, but it is happening already on the ground. But again, we can talk about strategic autonomy, but I think that it would not be good, and it would not be effective if strategic autonomy meant that Europeans decide that, okay, from now on, we do Libya alone, goodbye, leave us alone, we know better. It's not the approach that Europeans would take. We have multilateral approaches in our DNA. We will always reach out to partners starting from the United States and say, okay, what do we do together on this? Then we're ready to take our own responsibilities. But I think that, yes, readiness to do more in the region on the European side is there, but not alone. I don't think it would work and it would be fair. And then on, sorry, Erika, the other
Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and the UAE meeting today to discuss.
Yes. Yes, I think, you know, the Eastern Mediterranean is an interesting environment. It's the perfect example where the European Union has a clear role to play, but also might not be the best positioned player to play it. Why? Because Cyprus is a member state, Turkey is a NATO ally and a partner, and even an accession country in theory still, and a key player when it comes to the Syria conflict and the refugee management. I think that that area is an area where we would need a reinforced UN framework that is currently missing. Also because the interlinks in the region are much more complex than they might appear in the beginning. I know that you might know them more than me and very well, but one thing that I have experienced in my years in mandate is that you know, you have a surface of regional to regional relations, and sometimes you are tempted to go through that. For instance, European Union to African Union, or European Union to League of Arab States, and you categorize blocks, and then you look into that and you see that indeed you have natural alliances across blocks, and one against the other within blocks. And on the other side, an institution like the European Union has to keep contacts with its institutional interlocutor that, for instance, in that case, is the League of Arab States. I say this because, for instance, on Libya, every time that we tried to coordinate with the Arab countries or with the African countries, we came to the main element at the end of the day of a conflict within the Arab states, the League of Arab States, a complete division there, even more than the European division. On the Eastern Mediterranean, I think that what they're trying to do is to try and translate into some political benefit the potential of an economic cooperation, which is good. It's how the European Union started. I always say today we are 27 integrated, one currency, single market, everything, treaties, I mean, you name it, the most advanced experiment on earth of political integration in a region. And it all started with coal and steel community. Why? Because the concept was a very basic and utilitaristic one, but very effective, that after making war, if you start sharing an economic interest, it's very unlikely that you would go to war again against each other, because you share the same interests, economic interests, you don't fight. This is the basic concept of the European Union, and it works. So if we can manage to apply or to encourage the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East to apply the same principle, but also Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia have no exchanges among them, and they go through the European Union all the time. could we trigger an element of economic cooperation that would lead then to political and possibly security cooperation? That would be applying the European Union model and developing a region in all senses. In the Eastern Mediterranean, that is potentially possible. There is the minor element of Turkey that is clearly going to perceive this as an alliance against it. And here again comes the difficult, one of the most difficult files I think we have is this overlapping of NATO EU agendas on the Eastern Mediterranean that I find extremely difficult to, it would be very difficult to solve. But you didn't ask about Turkey, so I can stop there.
Ahmed, one final question. We have about 5 minutes left. Go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, my camera's off. Bit noise in the background. Thank you so much for this talk. My question was more on economic security and particularly looking into how Europe has handled the whole vaccine production, vaccine rollout, vaccine exports. How do you view the economic, like wielding economic tools for your own security, and how Europe, as some would say, failed in this regards, and also how push from the Italian government recently made Europe take a harder stance on that. How do you see this in terms of like the economic security of the bloc and the different approach that they took compared to the US, where exporting vaccines or even raw material was banned for almost a year now?
Yes, I think that more than an economic issue here, it's a health and safety issue for our population. There is, yes, indeed, there is a debate about the banning of exports, but there is also a more fundamental element, that is the fact that most of the vaccines we are importing from outside of the European Union. So there's an element there. There is indeed a sense of, there is a mixed sense, I think, in Europe about how the European Union reacted to the pandemic. To keep it short, because we have a few minutes, I think that there is, in the very beginning, then I'm Italian, so I've seen the entire story with a particular angle. In the very beginning, I think the impression was that the European Union was not ready to react, was not even understanding the scope of it, but it was not the only one. I mean, in the United States, you know that better than us. But in the very beginning, in February, March last year, there was a slow reaction due to the fact that the crisis was unprecedented, but also due to the fact that there was a very different perception across Europe of the gravity of the crisis. In some countries, it was self-evident that it was major and massive and dramatic. In some other countries, it was not even perceived as such. I lived it on my own skin because I was in February, January last year, I was in Belgium where I live, but I was obviously following news from Italy where my family and friends are. And if you looked in the course of 1 hour, the news in Italy and the news in Belgium, it was two different words, completely different words. And that lasted for a month. So I go back to the same point, if you don't share information, if you don't have the same analysis of the gravity of the situation, you also don't have common policies possible because you lack the motivation, the political will to act. So after a slow start, I think that the European Union managed to do incredibly well in terms of the economic recovery package. That was really impressive, fast, with a jump into something that was never there before, reacting together, and in a way that I think was considered in the United States from some sides of the United States that are now in the administration as a model on how to react on the economic recovery side. In the meantime, on the sanitary side, on the health supplies, on the supply chain, on the vaccines, it started to act, but don't forget, the European Union doesn't have a competence on health issues. It's national, it's countries that have the competence on health issues. The European Union doesn't have anything to do on that, or almost. It has started to do that, going beyond its own competences formally. I think it was correct, it was right to do so, because it allowed us to use the economy of scale in negotiating the contracts. I always say, all those that criticize how the European Union did on the vaccination acquisition, try to imagine how the single member states would have done without, some of them being very small member states, going out there and trying to get the vaccines for the entire population alone, bilaterally, maybe competing one European country with the other for the supplies. That would be a disaster. So you can criticize the shortcomings of what is in place, but try to imagine what could have been without that. It could have been much worse. It could have been also better for some countries, maybe, but I'm not sure about that. And again, it's somehow an experiment because it's not part of the European competences. So somehow, I think the European Union was, for once, brave in stepping in a moment of need, even beyond its own responsibilities, and trying to give an answer. Perfect? No, definitely not. Some mistakes, I think, were made. And then again, it's not my field of expertise specifically. But I think it was courageous. On the economic point of view, it was definitely a game changer. And on the also on the health point of view, I think that it was a brave step forward. It probably created a situation that is now better than it would have been without. But again, lessons to be learned for the future, for sure, including on the need to invest on research, which is something
Federica,
yeah.
I realized we could go on for at least another 45
but
minutes.
I think our time is over now.
But we have you have done a tremendous job in Franco-Europeanese. We would call this a tour de force, because that's truly what it was over this past hour and a half, not only to provide the most succinct history of the entire European sovereignty debate, which will get its own political angles as we move into critical election years in Germany and certainly in France. I think we're all on our pins and needles to see how Emmanuel Macron will redefine European sovereignty in his electoral campaign as he heads into the early months of 2022. So there are all the underlying political dimensions which are still in the water. And so this is clearly something that we're all going to watch very, very closely. But I think you've left no region unturned or untouched by the European hand. And you've given us incredible insights, particularly on how the system operates and how these ideas have germinated to the fore. If we had more time, I'd ask you about decision making and political principles. QMV, of course, a big qualified majority voting, always a big issue on how we wrest away some of the still vestiges of the nation state, possibly to the union level and the difficulties there. But I think for our students who are highly, as we've all seen over this past hour and a half, motivated and interested in these issues, and who don't nearly enough have the kind of teaching which you have provided over these 90 minutes, I think this was a wonderful and fulsome excursion on which we could go on. Our project is committed to doing more of this. We are thrilled that you will remain closely allied to our work and are happy to have you back on campus. I know we all felt it was an enormous win when you were here, well, now almost 2 years ago. So we're very much looking forward to having you back in Cambridge, though not on a day like today when it's frankly snowing outside. But thank you for this time, for being so forthcoming, wonderfully honest and refreshing. And we're going to replay this as the semester ends, and then hopefully soon in person. Please join me and everybody else who's put so much effort into organizing this in thanking Federica Mogherini for the virtual round of applause.
Thank you. It's me thanking you. Hope to see you soon in person.
Indeed. Be
Have a
well,
good day.
everybody. Be safe and be warm and dry wherever you are.
You too. Enjoy the snow.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.